At our baby shower, my wife's mother whispered, "You're a temporary mistake. Her ex is still the one she runs to." My wife smirked, said nothing. I nodded silently and went back to hanging balloons. 3 days later, I got 30 missed calls and a message that made my jaw drop. The morning of the baby shower started with a checklist and coffee gone cold. I was up before the sun, stacking folding chairs into the trunk of my car and checking off balloon delivery, cupcake pickup, and renting a speaker that I still wasn't sure we needed. My wife, Madeline, was asleep when I left. At 32 weeks pregnant, I didn't blame her for wanting to rest. But the truth? Even before the first guest arrived, I already felt like background noise in my own life. We were hosting the party at her parents' house, big, suburban, Pinterest perfect. The kind of house her mother, Carol, loved showing off to her garden club friends and yoga group. The moment I walked through the front door, I was no longer Madeline's husband. I was the help. Carol barely acknowledged me. Just handed me a list and started barking instructions like a wedding planner on espresso. "Move that table closer to the window. Those streamers are too low. Don't wrinkle the tablecloth, it's real linen." I nodded, bit my tongue, and did everything she asked. I've never had illusions about how Carol feels about me. From day one, she made it clear I wasn't good enough for her daughter. My job wasn't impressive. My car was too old. Our apartment was quaint, which was Carol speak for too small to breathe in. Madeline always told me to ignore it. "She's just intense," she'd say. "Don't take it personally." But it was always personal. I used to think things would get better once we were married. I thought once Carol saw how happy I made Madeline, she'd soften. But instead, it felt like my ring gave her more ammunition. Now I wasn't just an unworthy boyfriend. I was the man who trapped her daughter into a modest life. By 11:30, guests started arriving. I was still setting up chairs in the backyard when I saw Madeline glide out onto the patio in a flowing cream maternity dress. She looked beautiful. Glowing even. She saw me and smiled. But not the real smile, the one she gave to people when she was performing. She kissed me on the cheek. "Try not to sweat through your shirt," she whispered, laughing as she adjusted my collar. "Thanks," I muttered. Then she was gone, swallowed up by cousins and old high school friends and women in floral dresses I didn't recognize. I stayed near the edge of the party, offering drinks, moving chairs, picking up empty plates. Just out of the way enough not to ruin the aesthetic. I watched as Madeline posed for pictures, her hand delicately placed on her stomach while guests fawned over her. She laughed at their jokes. Nodded politely. It was like watching someone else. Someone polished and practiced. Someone who looked past me like I was part of the scenery. And that's when Carol cornered me. She stepped outside with a mimosa in hand and that same tight, sour smile she always wore around me. I was rezacking paper cups. "You know," she began, swirling her drink, "Madeline made a huge mistake marrying so young." I froze. She didn't wait for me to respond. "I mean, you're sweet." "Really? But she could have done so much better. Someone with stability. A proper career. A real house." I looked at her. No words. Just blinking. She leaned in slightly like she was letting me in on a secret. "I'm just grateful her ex is still in the picture, at least for emotional support. You know how hard this is on her." My jaw tensed. "Is that a threat?" Carol laughed like I'd told a joke. "Of course not, dear. It's just Madeline needs more than someone who can lift chairs." Before I could reply, Madeline walked over. Carol smiled wide, fake as ever. "Darling, I was just telling your husband how proud we are of you." Madeline giggled, placed her hands on her belly, and leaned against me. She didn't look at me, just let her head rest for the photo her sister was snapping. I wanted to scream. Instead, I smiled, nodded, and went back to setting up the gift table. But the thoughts wouldn't stop. That wasn't just a moment of pettiness. That was who they were. Who she was. I could see now what I'd been avoiding. I told myself love meant compromise. That you deal with in-laws. That not everyone gets the fairy tale. But this wasn't just difficult. This was betrayal in slow motion. Madeline had heard what her mother said. She didn't step in. She didn't defend me. She didn't even blink. Because, deep down, maybe she agreed. I kept moving, kept doing my part. Guests were laughing, eating finger sandwiches, playing baby-themed games. I was still serving like everything was normal. Someone handed me a plate. I took it. Smiled. Said thank you. But inside, something broke. After the cake was cut, after the last picture was taken, I slipped inside to the guest bathroom. Washed my face. Looked at myself. And I didn't recognize the man in the mirror. He looked tired. Smaller. Not just physically, like something had been drained out of him. Piece by piece. I leaned on the sink, gripped the sides, and stared. "Get through today," I whispered. "Just today." So I did. I helped clean up, thanked the guests, carried leftovers to the car, hugged relatives I barely knew, played my part to the very end. No one noticed how quiet I was. No one asked. That night when we got home, Madeline went straight to bed. She didn't say thank you. Didn't ask how I was. Just dropped onto the mattress and scrolled through her phone. I stood in the kitchen for a long time. Lights off. Just me and the refrigerator hum. Then I sat down. Opened my laptop. Booked a motel room for 2 nights. Not forever. Just enough time to think. I wrote her a note and left it in her sock drawer. It said, "When you're ready to treat me like your partner, not your assistant, we can talk. Until then, I need space." I packed a small bag, took my keys, and left without a sound. Not because I was weak. Because I finally realized I didn't owe them a scene. I owed myself a way out. The motel room was small, clean, and completely silent. The kind of place with buzzing overhead lights and curtains that never quite close all the way. But it had something I hadn't felt in a long time: control. There was no Carol. No Madeline. No chore list. No quiet jabs passed off as jokes. Just me. And stillness. I dropped my bag on the chair, sat on the edge of the bed, and stared at the wall. It took a while to stop shaking. Not because I was scared of what I'd done, but because for the first time in years I'd drawn a boundary. A real one. One that didn't come with an apology or an explanation. The silence was heavy at first. It felt like grief. Like something was dying in me, or maybe something had already died and I was just now noticing the absence. I went out and bought dinner from a food truck. Ate it in the parking lot. No music. No noise. Just the sound of wind and the hum of tires on the freeway in the distance. That night I didn't sleep much. I kept thinking about the baby. About what kind of father I wanted to be. What kind of partner I had become. And what kind of man I had let myself shrink into. The next morning I made another list. 1. Rent a short-term place. 2. Let Madeline reach out first. 3. Don't cave. 4. Remember, quiet isn't failure. I spent the day apartment hunting online. Made 3 calls. Booked 2 showings. It was mechanical, emotionless. But it felt like motion. By day 3, my phone started buzzing. Madeline, where are you? Madeline, are you seriously doing this now? Madeline, you're being so immature. I didn't answer. Then came Carol. Carol, Madeline's upset. She needs you to stop being dramatic and come home. This isn't the time for games. Games. That word lit something in me. For years, they made me feel like I was the unstable one. The oversensitive one. The one who couldn't take a joke. But what they never saw was how every joke cost me something. Every jab shaved off a piece of who I was. I rented a small apartment 2 neighborhoods over. It had peeling paint, loud plumbing, and the smell of someone else's life in the walls. But it also had a door that locked from the inside. And a kitchen I could make toast in without being told I was doing it wrong. I left my new address off the lease contact. I didn't want to be found. Not yet. Instead, I texted Madeline one thing. I'm safe. I need space. I'll reach out when I'm ready. She didn't respond right away. When she finally did, it was only 2 words. Too late. I stared at it for a while. Wondered what it meant. Was it a threat? A cry? An attempt to hurt me? Or just frustration from someone who wasn't used to being left waiting? Either way, I put the phone down, turned it off, and stared at the ceiling until I fell asleep. That was the first night I slept through until morning. The apartment wasn't much. 2nd floor of a crumbling brownstone. 1 bedroom. No elevator. The floors creaked. The shower handle spun too easily. But the place had light. And it had silence. I spent the first few days furnishing it piece by piece. A second-hand couch. A cheap desk. I bought a lamp from a thrift store that buzzed faintly when turned on. It didn't matter. It was mine. No one commented on my choices. No one told me to maybe pick something that matched. No one rolled their eyes when I paused too long picking out a curtain color. I stocked the fridge with things I liked. Cooked eggs at midnight. Left dishes in the sink without guilt. I was relearning how to move in a space that didn't punish me. Madeline called a few more times. I let them go to voicemail. One message stood out. I just want to talk. If we're going to raise a child, we have to communicate. She wasn't wrong. But she also wasn't ready to listen. Not yet. I responded 2 days later. Talking requires respect. I won't be spoken to like a disappointment anymore. No reply. I went for a walk that evening. Past a playground. Sat on a bench near the swings. Watched kids chase each other across the mulch. I thought about my kid. About the day I'd meet them. Hold them. The kind of father I wanted to be. Present. Calm. Solid. Not perfect. But real. That night I wrote a journal entry. I want my kid to know me. Not the edited version. Not the one who shrinks to keep the peace. I want to raise them in truth. In strength. In silence that heals instead of shames. I closed the journal and let that intention sit. Madeline texted the next morning. My mom wants to talk to you. She says you overreacted. I read it 3 times. Then deleted it. I made eggs. Sat on the floor. Ate slowly. And smiled to myself. I was beginning to remember who I was before the world told me I wasn't enough. The calls didn't stop. They just changed tone. Madeline's messages went from sharp to panicked in less than a week. At first it was all indignation. I can't believe you walked out. You're abandoning your own child. Everyone thinks you've lost it. Then came the shift. I didn't know Mom was going to say that. She just gets worked up sometimes. I didn't laugh at you, I was nervous. I didn't reply. Because I'd learned that silence has weight. And mine was starting to feel like armor. By day 10, Carol reached out again. I hope you're proud of yourself. She's crying nonstop. You've humiliated this family. There it was, the word again, family. Like I was never part of it. Like I was a stranger they allowed to orbit them out of courtesy. Funny how people mourn your absence only when your presence stops serving them. Then came the messages from people I barely knew. Madeline's cousin. Her old roommate. A bridesmaid from our wedding who hadn't spoken to me since the honeymoon. All variations of the same sentiment. Please talk to her. She's really struggling. She needs you. Not one message asked if I was okay. Not one asked what led me to leave. They just wanted the version of me that held everything together, quietly, without complaint. And I was done being that man. I stayed silent. Until day 13. That morning I got a message from Madeline. I'm sorry. I miss you. Can we meet? I stared at it for a long time. Not because I didn't know how I felt, but because I knew exactly how I felt. And it scared me. I replied. 1 hour. Neutral place. No Carol. She agreed. We met at a coffee shop halfway between her parents' house and my apartment. I arrived early, sat facing the door, watched people come and go. When she walked in, I saw it instantly. She looked exhausted. Not physically, emotionally. Her eyes had lost that curated spark. Her smile, when it came, was unsteady. She sat down across from me. I didn't expect this, she said. What? You leaving? Quietly. Just disappearing. I stirred my coffee. Said nothing. She leaned in. I know my mom went too far. I should have said something. I froze. I didn't know what to do. I nodded. That's the problem, Maddie. You never know what to do when it's about me. She blinked. Her mouth opened, then closed. I kept going. You always knew what to say when she insulted other people. When she belittled waiters or neighbors or strangers. But when it was me. Silence. Her eyes welled up. She looked away. I wasn't trying to hurt you. I know, I said. But you did. Again and again. And I let it happen. That's on me. We sat in that quiet for a long time. She whispered, do you still want to raise this baby together? I took a breath. I want to raise them in truth. And that means they can't grow up watching one parent shrink for the other. She nodded. Slowly. Like she was finally hearing me. I need time, I said. Space. Respect. I can try. No, I said gently. You can do. Or not do. Trying was what got us here. We parted with a handshake. Strange. But honest. That night, for the first time since I left, I felt like I could see the road ahead. Not easy. Not clean. But mine. And that was enough to keep walking. In the days that followed, the silence shifted from tense to sacred. I stopped checking my phone every 10 minutes. I started noticing things again, the way light filtered through blinds, the comfort of clean sheets, the smell of toast in the morning. I bought a plant. Just a little fern, nothing fancy. It sat on my windowsill and leaned toward the sun. I watered it every other day. I don't know why it meant so much to me, but it felt like proof. That I could care for something and not break it. I started reading again. Not headlines. Not status updates. Real books. I lit a candle each night and gave myself permission to sit still. To feel safe in my own presence. Sometimes I wondered if Madeline would reach out again. Sometimes I hoped she wouldn't. One night, I dreamed about the baby. Not a full dream, just flashes. A small hand gripping my thumb. A quiet nursery. Laughter. Then crying, not theirs, mine. I woke up with a soaked pillow. Healing doesn't ask for permission. It just happens in moments you don't expect. That week, I got a letter. Handwritten. No return address. But I knew the handwriting. It was from Carol. It read, I may never understand your decision, but I see now that Madeline needed to hear you. Maybe I did too. That was all. No apology. No excuse. But for someone like her, it was almost a confession. I folded it carefully. Put it in the drawer. Didn't burn it. Didn't keep it on display. Just acknowledged it. Madeline texted once more the following week. I'm seeing a therapist. I'm trying to understand things better. Just wanted you to know. I replied. Good. That's all I said. That night I journaled one sentence. I don't want revenge. I want peace. And for the first time in years I actually believed that was possible. The morning she showed up I knew before I saw her. I don't mean that metaphorically. I mean I knew. There was a stillness in the street. A subtle shift in the air that told me something was about to knock on the door I had finally learned to close. I just finished my second cup of coffee when I heard the knock. Not loud. Not frantic. Just hesitant. I opened the door to find Madeline standing there. Puffy eyes. Jacket too thin for the wind. Her hand resting on her belly like she needed the reminder that life was still growing inside her. Can I come in? I didn't answer right away. I didn't move. I just looked at her, not with anger. Not even with hurt. Just quiet. I didn't know where else to go, she said. I nodded toward the bench near the sidewalk. We sat. She told me about the last few weeks. Her mother crossing line after line. Friends slowly stepping back. Loneliness creeping in at 2 a.m. She said she hadn't meant for things to go that far. I thought you'd come back on your own, she whispered. I thought you'd just absorb it like always. I stared at the cracks in the pavement. That's the problem, I said. You never thought I'd leave. She cried. Not for show. Not for pity. Just a quiet unraveling of everything she hadn't said sooner. I want to be better, she said. For the baby. For you. For me. I believed her. And I didn't. Because growth isn't words. It's days. It's silence. It's decisions made when no one is watching. We sat a while longer. Then I stood. I'm not coming back, I said. But I'll show up. For the baby. With boundaries. She nodded. It hurt her. I saw that. But she didn't argue. I'll be at the appointments, I added. But not in the house where I was invisible. More silence. Then she whispered, do you still love me? I thought about that. Enough to let you grow without me, I said. She left not long after. I watched her walk down the sidewalk slower than she used to, more careful. When I stepped back inside, the room felt warmer. Not because anything had changed, but because I had. I picked up the letter I wrote weeks ago, the one for our baby. I added one more line. The day you were born, I already knew who I was. And that to me was the beginning of everything.